Hi, David. We have a
Hi there.
surprise. This is not Brianna Joy Gray. If you've seen or heard Brianna Bree, you may notice that she usually looks a little different, and that is because Brianna will be joining us shortly. But we are blessed with a double Sandersian billing tonight. They're so much more than members of the former Sanders campaign, of course. David is actually an award-winning journalist, and he just joined Jacobin. So wanted to have you on to talk about what you're up to now and also your latest piece.
So I'm an editor-at-large at Jacobin. I'm a Guardian columnist. I'm doing a newsletter. Folks can find it at my website, davidsirota.com. And the story we broke this week was about Governor Andrew Cuomo and campaign donations and nursing home deaths. They may not seem like they're related, but critics argue that they are. Here's what happened. New York has had a terrible spate of nursing home deaths in the pandemic, as many people know. What a lot of people don't know is that Andrew Cuomo put into his budget a provision that grants nursing home and hospital executives immunity from civil litigation and government prosecution, essentially shielding them from liability for things like negligence, things that critics say have increased death in the pandemic. So the pandemic hits, this crisis happens, he responds by putting this stealth provision into his budget, which grants hospital corporation and nursing home corporation executives and board members immunity from essentially legal consequences for their actions. Now, that would be enough of a story to be a story. But on top of all of that, the provision was drafted by and pushed by the major hospital lobby group in New York that delivered more than $1 million to Andrew Cuomo's political machine during his reelection race. In all, $2.3 million of money went into that machine from hospital interests and nursing home interests while Cuomo was running for reelection. And I should add their lobbying firms as well. So you have a situation in which Cuomo's response protected the interests that gave him lots of money. And the third part of the story is how there is now data that critics who are trying to repeal this immunity provision, that they point to and say that the immunity stuff is actually making the situation worse. They argue that there have been more deaths in states, more nursing home deaths in states that have offered up this kind of immunity for nursing home executives. The idea being that when corporate executives don't have to fear for the legal consequences of their decisions, they will make decisions that are not in the interests of patients, decisions that are more in the interests of their own bottom line. And that's a key point here, that nursing homes, when we think about their business model, as it was said to me and reported in this article, that nursing homes, when they make staffing decisions, that's the big decision, how many staff you're going to have there, how many people, on the floor of the nursing home, that if you don't have to fear or you have less to fear for legal consequences of death or injury in those nursing homes, you may hire fewer people, which is less overhead, which is more profit for the company and for the executives.
Yeah, so you're saying it basically acts as a deterrent potentially, right? And it no longer acts as a deterrent if you are giving people immunity.
And it's like a get out of jail free card, right?
Right. And if you're not fearing jail, you're not going to necessarily, if all you have guiding you is the bottom line and you have no consequences to face, why would you not err on the side of not of life, err on the side of death, honestly, in this case?
I mean, that's the whole theory. And let's be clear, no one is saying that each individual nursing home or hospital needs to be sued or needs to be prosecuted. We're talking about preemptive immunity from litigation and prosecution before a case is even adjudicated. The point being that it's saying that these executives, and let's be clear, not the workers, right?
Right.
Not the frontline workers. The workers, that's a whole other debate about whether they should have immunity from prosecution or civil litigation. That's less. Cuomo expanded the immunity from the workers on the front lines to the corporate executives, the decision makers. And what that really says is that people can't even go into court to argue that those executives were making negligent decisions or malicious decisions. That's what an immunity clause. It doesn't say you have to be convicted. It actually goes further and says you can't even adjudicate this.
Right.
We're going to give you that shield. And what's really been cynical about this is that the nursing home industry, the hospital industry, Cuomo's administration have argued that they've made an argument about the workers, the workers, the doctors, the nurses, that they shouldn't have to be thinking about whether they're going to get sued. But again, what Cuomo did was expand the immunity to the CEOs, to the owners, to the corporate executives, where you really, it's much harder to make an argument that they need legal immunity. I mean, that's the whole point from the legal experts that I talked to who said, look, it's debatable whether workers need immunity or
Right.
not. That's a whole separate issue. But the way that we've been able to make positive changes in nursing homes is through class action lawsuits where the corporation and the executives are held accountable, and then they have to change the larger corporate-wide decisions that they make. You take away the ability to hold those corporate executives accountable, and they don't have to make decisions that are in the interest of patients.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really, this is such an important story because I think, and we actually talked about this story on Useful Idiots. We do the 4 basic food groups. Democrats suck, Republicans suck. Isn't that terrible? And isn't that weird? And so your story was part of our Democrats suck for this week. And, Matt Taibbi and I talk a lot about how much Cuomo, because he's not Trump, because he doesn't say inject yourself with bleach, he gets a get out of jail free card from the left too, and from liberals, and he's seen as decisive, and he's seen as mentally he's seen as information based, science based. And you're obviously not actually helping people when you kind of say judge people by better than Trump, or at least they're not Trump.
Yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, I think that Cuomo is information based.
Right.
Cuomo is, like in this case, this wasn't some accident. I mean, it's an annual spending bill. This is very specific legislation, very specific language, and the language explicitly talks about executives, board members, and the like. So this is a carefully crafted piece of legislation that was inserted into a 300+ page budget bill by the governor's administration. So this wasn't just like, oh, I didn't realize that this, like,
Right.
oh, I didn't realize it would be interpreted this way, or oh, I had no idea. No, he's
Right, of course,
very deliberate action for very deliberate results to protect clearly a set of interests that had given him an enormous amount of money. This is not $5,000 or $10,000. This is $1 million plus in the middle of his, primary campaign. So this is an industry that really came to his defense and that he put in specific legislation. So I would argue that Cuomo being far more lucid and in touch with the details and information-based actually makes this situation more incriminating because there's no plausible deniability here.
Right. I think he scares people less, right? Because they don't think he's going to say something outrageous. But what we've seen again and again is the danger of non-Trumps, right? This is like a time where we're reminded so much of how dangerous it is. If your only criteria is not as insane or not as outrageous as Trump, what are you doing? Because you're normalizing every other behavior, and you're normalizing very craven behavior. And again, you get this a ton. I get this too. Like our next guest, Brianna Joy Gray, gets this like, why do you always pick on Dems? Why don't you pick on Republicans? And first of all, it's just not true. You've done a lot of investigations into, what is it, the Corker kickback? And stuff. So that's a ridiculous thing. But
yeah, look, we had a story today. I mean, the story today, the follow-up story was about how Republican governors are now also being pushed to grant this immunity. And guess what? Those Republican governors, their state parties, their campaigns, they've gotten a lot of money from the same interests that are pushing this immunity. I mean, that's the thing. Cuomo is pushing in doing this immunity thing. This has been a Republican cause, quote unquote. This is part of tort reform, which has been the Republican cause to
frivolous laws, corporations
from
or whatever.
This is actually a narrow version, a state-based somewhat narrower version of exactly what Mitch McConnell is pushing. Mitch
Right.
McConnell wants liability for corporations that bring workers back to the workplace during the pandemic, and liability immunity if those corporations jeopardize the lives
What
of
could
their
go
workers.
wrong? What could possibly go wrong there?
Yeah, it's all part of the same thing. So
Right.
so the thing that I think confuses people is the Republicans are on policy, or the Democrats are sometimes doing some of the same exact kinds
Right.
of things that the Republicans are doing. And just because it's a Democrat doing it doesn't mean that doesn't deserve scrutiny.
Right. And if anything, I mean, as someone, we're obviously all, I mean, I don't know what, we're all not Republicans. And part of the reason that it's so frustrating and that the criticism is so warranted is because how do you think we defeat not just Trump, but Trumpism? It's not by having like austerity, fiscal conservatism. It's not being Trump without the terrible discourse. It's just not enough.
I mean, that's exactly right. That I think Trump's performative behavior
Right.
offends people, understandably so, at a visceral level.
Right.
And that means that many people presume that a Democrat who behaves with more etiquette, who isn't as performatively outrageous, that means that Democrat is automatically policy by policy better. But
Right.
policy by policy, oftentimes Democrats in the mold of Andrew Cuomo, on the actual policy, the things that are put into the law, they are oftentimes not better. I mean, the obvious example is you have a U.S. House controlled by the Democrats. The Democrats in the U.S. House passed Trump's corporate bailout by voice vote. The original corporate $4 trillion bailout by voice vote. $4 trillion more than we spent in the entire Iraq war. $4 trillion voice voted through by the Democratic House. Now, the House Democrats are less performatively outrageous on camera than Donald Trump. Absolutely true. And I would add that the House Democrats on many policies are better than Donald Trump. But it's an example of House Democrats literally unanimously passed Donald Trump's agenda on the substance that is Donald Trump's agenda. And that deserves to be scrutinized with the same concern that we scrutinize the policy that is handed down by Donald Trump's White House.
Right.